On February 22, 1944, 26,000 feet above the frozen German city of Oschersleben, a 23-year-old pilot named Thomas Riley was about to learn what impossible really meant. He was flying a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber that the American press had dubbed the most indestructible aircraft in the sky. But right now, that nickname felt like a cruel joke. His fortress was about to become a coffin. The mission was straightforward on paper. The 8th Air Force had sent 341 heavy bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany to destroy aircraft factories. Riley's squadron, part of the 91st Bomb Group flying out of Bassingbourn, England, was at the head of the bomber stream. That meant they would be first over the target. That meant they would absorb the worst of everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Riley knew this. His crew knew this. But knowledge doesn't stop fear, and it certainly doesn't stop bullets. The approach to the target was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then the sky erupted. Flak bursts turned the air black. German fighters, Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, came screaming through the formation in waves. They weren't just attacking, they were hunting. Riley's bomber, which his crew had painted with the name Iron Will, was flying at the tip of the formation. It was the most exposed position in the entire bomber stream. It was where the Germans always attacked first. The first wave of fighters came from 12 o'clock high, head-on attacks, the most terrifying tactic the Luftwaffe had perfected. 20-millimeter cannons winking in the cold morning sun. Riley saw the tracers arc toward him. He couldn't dodge. He was locked into formation. To break formation was to die alone. He gripped the control yoke and held his course. Then the world exploded. Cannon shells ripped through the nose of the aircraft. The plexiglass bombardier's compartment shattered. Ice-cold air at 40 below zero blasted into the cockpit. Riley felt something slam into his chest. His flak jacket had just saved his life. An unexploded 20-millimeter shell was embedded in the armor plate, inches from his heart. The bombardier in the nose, a kid from Ohio named Danny Walsh, wasn't so lucky. The blast had torn through his position. The navigator was screaming something on the intercom, but the radio was filled with static and the howl of wind through the shattered nose. Riley called for a damage report. What came back was chaos. The ball turret gunner, suspended in his rotating sphere beneath the aircraft, reported that the bomb bay doors were smashed. Fluid was leaking from the No. 3 engine. The 2 waist gunners, standing amid a growing pile of spent .50 caliber shell casings, said there were holes everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The top turret gunner said the No. 2 engine was smoking. Riley looked at his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping, hydraulic pressure dropping, airspeed falling. They were dying in the air. But the attack wasn't over. The second wave of German fighters came 30 minutes later. Another coordinated assault. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving through the formation from every angle. Riley's crew fought back. The 13 .50 caliber machine guns mounted in turrets and waist positions roared to life. Empty shell casings rained down inside the aircraft like brass hail. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid filled the cramped interior. But the Germans were veterans. They knew how to kill a fortress. More cannon fire, more shrapnel. The No. 2 engine seized. The propeller froze. Riley feathered it, stopping its rotation to reduce drag. They were down to 3 engines. Then, the No. 3 engine started losing power. The leak from earlier was now a hemorrhage. Oil streamed back over the wing, painting it black. Riley pushed the remaining engines to their limits. The right cyclone radials screamed in protest. They needed to stay with the formation. A bomber alone was a bomber dead. The third wave hit them just after they dropped their bombs on target. This time, the attack was personal. The German fighters had identified Iron Will as wounded. Like wolves, they circled, waiting for it to fall behind. Riley fought to maintain altitude and speed. His co-pilot, a farm boy from Nebraska named Jack Morrison, was calling out engine temperatures and fuel levels. None of the numbers were good. They were losing altitude at 200 feet per minute. They were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate, and the German fighters were still out there, circling, waiting. Then disaster struck. Flak. A burst so close, Riley felt the concussion through his seat. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. The No. 4 engine, Their only remaining good engine on the starboard side took a direct hit. The propeller shattered. Metal fragments scythed through the wing. Fire erupted from the engine cowling. Riley and Morrison reached for the fire extinguisher controls at the same instant. They dumped the chemical suppressant into the engine compartment. The flames sputtered and died. But the engine was gone. They were now flying on two engines, both on the port side. This was the moment where doctrine said to bail out. Two engines on one side, hydraulics failing, controls damaged, over enemy territory. The B-17 flight manual didn't have a chapter for this situation because the manual assumed you'd be dead already. Riley looked at his altimeter. They were at 11,000 feet and dropping. He looked at his fuel gauges. They had maybe 2 hours of flying time left. He looked at the map. They were still deep inside Germany, 300 miles from the English Channel. Then he looked at his crew. The navigator was pressing bandages against a wound in his arm. The radio operator was manually cranking the bomb bay doors closed because the hydraulics were shot. The tail gunner was reporting more German fighters assembling behind them. These men had families. They had futures. Riley made a decision that would haunt every pilot who heard this story for decades. He wasn't bailing out. He was going to fly this dying aircraft home. What happened next defied every law of aerodynamics and probability. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to be tough, but what Riley was attempting wasn't tough. It was impossible. With two engines on one side dead, the aircraft wanted to roll. The asymmetric thrust pulled them into a constant left turn. Riley and Morrison had to fight the controls every second. Their arms burned, their hands cramped, but they held that yoke in place with pure willpower. They couldn't maintain altitude. They descended through 10,000 feet, 9,000, 8,000. They were dropping into the range where German flak was most accurate, but they had no choice. The two remaining engines, already working beyond their design limits, couldn't carry the weight of the damaged bomber any higher. Riley ordered everything jettisoned, ammunition, guns, anything not bolted down went out the waist gun positions. The crew stripped the aircraft bare. The German fighters followed them down. But something strange happened. The Luftwaffe pilots, veterans who had shot down dozens of Allied bombers, didn't attack. They flew alongside Iron Will for several minutes. Riley could see the German pilots in their cockpits. One of them, flying a Focke-Wulf 190, pulled up close enough that Riley could make out his face. The German pilot looked at the shattered bomber, looked at the feathered propellers, looked at the gaping holes in the fuselage. Then he did something extraordinary. He saluted, and he broke off his attack. This was the moment that separated men from machines. This was the Saburo Sakai moment. This was when the enemy recognized not just courage, but something deeper, something that transcended nationality or uniform. The German pilot had seen a crew refusing to die. He had seen a pilot doing the impossible, and he chose honor over another kill. The other German fighters followed their leader. They peeled away. They left Iron Will to its fate, whatever that would be. But survival wasn't guaranteed just because the Germans had left. Riley's battle was now against physics. They were at 6,000 feet limping across occupied France. The two remaining engines were overheating. The cylinder head temperatures were in the red. Morrison was calling out the numbers: 700 degrees, 750, 800. At 850 degrees, an aircraft engine seizes. They were at 820. Riley reduced power slightly. They lost more altitude, 5,000 feet, 4,000. They were now low enough that German anti-aircraft batteries opened up. Flak bursts bracketed them, but Riley couldn't climb. He couldn't accelerate. He could only maintain his heading and pray. One burst exploded directly beneath them. The aircraft bucked. More holes appeared in the wings, but the engines kept running. The engineers at Wright Aeronautical, who designed the Cyclone radials, had built them tough. They were now proving exactly how tough. They crossed the French coast at 2,000 feet. The English Channel stretched before them like a gray eternity. Riley checked his fuel. The gauges were at 0. But fuel gauges lie. There's always a reserve, a few gallons trapped in the lines and tanks that the gauge doesn't register. Riley was betting his life and the lives of his crew that those few gallons existed. Morrison radioed ahead. They were declaring an emergency. They were requesting a straight-in approach. They would not be able to go around for a second attempt. They got one shot at this. The English coast appeared through the haze. Dover. Beautiful, rocky, impossible Dover. They were at 1,000 feet, then 800. The engines were coughing, fuel starvation. The props were starting to windmill. Riley aimed for the nearest airfield. It wasn't their home base. It was an emergency field, a short runway carved into the countryside, specifically for aircraft like his, aircraft that were dying in the air. At 500 feet, the number one engine quit, just stopped. The propeller froze. They were flying on one engine, one single right cyclone radial, overheated, fuel-starved, damaged by shrapnel, was keeping 45,000 pounds of aircraft crew and equipment in the air. Morrison was doing the calculations in his head. They couldn't make it. The math said they would hit the ground 3 miles short of the runway, but Thomas Riley wasn't flying by math. He was flying on instinct. He lowered the landing gear manually. The hydraulics were gone, so the crew cranked the gear down by hand. 300 turns of a manual crank. The wheels locked into place. Riley felt the drag. The aircraft slowed. They dropped faster. 400 feet, 300. He could see the runway now. He could also see the trees between him and that runway. The last engine was sputtering, coughing, dying. Riley had no flaps. The hydraulics that controlled them were shot. He had minimal control authority. The cables to the elevators were damaged. He was flying a 30-ton brick, 200 feet. The trees were getting closer, 100 feet. The engine gave one final surge of power. Then it died. Complete silence except for the whistle of wind through 1,000 holes. The B-17 cleared the trees by 15 feet. It dropped onto the runway in a controlled crash. The landing was so hard the tail wheel collapsed. The aircraft slewed sideways. Metal screamed against concrete. Sparks flew. The wings flexed, but the fuselage held. The bomber skidded for 300 yards before finally, mercifully, coming to rest. Riley and Morrison sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the controls, unable to move. The crew chief who ran up to the aircraft counted the damage later. 1,247 holes. That number became legend. 1,247 separate penetrations of the aircraft's skin, cannon shells, machine gun rounds, shrapnel. The wings looked like Swiss cheese. The fuselage looked like it had been attacked by a giant with a hole punch. 4 engines destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Hydraulic systems shredded, electrical systems shot out, flight control cables hanging by threads. The aircraft's structural integrity was compromised in 17 locations, by every engineering specification, by every maintenance manual, by every law of physics. This aircraft should have broken apart in mid-air. But it didn't. When the ground crew helped the exhausted crew out of the bomber, they found something remarkable. Aside from the bombardier's wounds and minor injuries, every man had survived. 10 men had flown through hell in a dying aircraft and lived. The medics arrived. The ambulances were waved off. They weren't needed. The crew stood on the runway, looking at their bomber. Someone said what they were all thinking. That's impossible. The investigating officers arrived the next day. They walked around Iron Will in stunned silence. They examined the damage. They photographed it from every angle. They took statements from the crew. The report they filed was clinical and professional. But the conclusion was inescapable. By all known engineering principles, this aircraft should not have been capable of flight, yet it had flown for over 300 miles on failing systems and dead engines. The newspapers got hold of the story. The photo of Iron Will sitting on that runway, her skin a patchwork of holes, became one of the most famous images of the air war over Europe. But Thomas Riley didn't want to talk about it. He wasn't a hero in his own mind. He was a pilot who had done what needed to be done. He had brought his crew home. That was the job. But what was the ripple effect of this impossible flight? It was hope. In 1944, American bomber crews were facing a nightmare. The loss rates were staggering. Some missions saw 25% casualties. A standard tour of duty was 25 missions. The statistics said you had almost no chance of completing that tour. Airmen were doing the math. They were living with the knowledge that they were probably going to die. Then, stories like Riley's spread through the bomber bases, stories of impossible survival, Stories of aircraft that shouldn't have flown but did. Stories of crews that refused to give up. These stories mattered more than any official morale program. They proved that survival was possible, that giving up wasn't inevitable, that sometimes, just sometimes, willpower and skill could overcome impossible odds. The engineering teams descended on Iron Will like archaeologists on a tomb. They wanted to understand how she had survived. What they found changed how B-17s were built for the rest of the war. The redundancy in the control systems, the structural over-engineering, the placement of critical components, all of it had contributed to survival. But the engineers also found something they couldn't measure or quantify. They found evidence of field modifications, little changes made by crew chiefs and mechanics, an extra cable routing, a reinforcement plate welded in an unexpected place. These weren't in any manual. These were the piano wire modifications of the air war. Thomas Riley flew 14 more missions. He completed his tour of duty. He survived the war. He went home to a small town in Pennsylvania, married his high school sweetheart, and never spoke about the war unless asked. When historians found him decades later, he was working as a civil engineer, designing bridges. They asked him how he had done it, how he had flown an impossible aircraft back to England. His answer was simple. I had a crew counting on me. The aircraft did her part. I just did mine. But that undersells what really happened on February 22, 1944. What happened was a perfect alignment of human determination, engineering excellence, and that indefinable quality that separates survival from death. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name that day, not because it was invincible, but because in the hands of a skilled crew who refused to accept death, it was tougher than the sum of its parts. Iron Will never flew again. The damage was too extensive. She was stripped for parts and eventually scrapped, but her legacy lived on. Every time a bomber crew faced impossible odds and kept fighting, they were channeling the spirit of that impossible flight. Every time an aircraft brought its crew home despite catastrophic damage, the ground crews whispered the number, 1,247. That number became more than a statistic. It became a symbol. It meant that impossible was just a word. It meant that giving up was a choice, not a requirement. It meant that sometimes the difference between life and death wasn't equipment or training or luck. It was the refusal to accept that death was inevitable. Thomas Riley died in 2006 at the age of 85. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his engineering career, his family, his service in World War II. It mentioned that he had received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. But it didn't mention the number. The reporters didn't know. The general public had forgotten, but the survivors remembered. The men who had flown with him, the crews who had heard the story, the pilots who had faced their own impossible moments. They remembered 1,247. They remembered that on a frozen February day over Germany, death had reached out for 10 men in a dying bomber. And those 10 men had looked death in the eye and said, "Not today." That's how wars are won, not by the biggest bombs or the fastest fighters, but by ordinary men who, when faced with the impossible, decide that impossible just means no one has done it yet. Thomas Riley was that man. His crew was those men. And Iron Will was their fortress, the fortress that refused to fall.